We move on to the third pairing within material culture and the symbolic. And our first speaker in this section is Judy Kertész, who is assistant professor in the Department of History at North Carolina State University. Judy.
Thank you so much, Ivan and Sarah, for your too generous invitation. Thank you all for having to slog through this, what will be a 10-minute presentation. Go! Basically, going to be asking you to consider the political lives of 4 disembodied, disarticulated Native American heads and what they can tell us about, I guess, the material culture of colonization. In 2009, 20 descendants of the Holy Man and Mescalero Chiricahua Apache resistance leader Geronimo filed a lawsuit against Skull and Bones, an undergraduate senior secret society at Yale University, the university itself, and members of the US government, including Barack Obama. This legal suit had all the ingredients of the ultimate conspiracy theory. The oft-told tale is that in 1917, the father and grandfather of 2 US presidents, Prescott Bush, and some of his buddies at Yale called Bonesmen, sorry you Yaleys out there, dug up the grave of Geronimo, removed his skull, and placed them in a glass case in the lobby of the Tomb, the headquarters of Yale University's not-so-secret society. It's a story that's become legend at Yale, passed down from generation to generation, a story compelling enough that the descendants of Geronimo filed their lawsuit on February 17, 2009, the 100th year anniversary of Apache warrior Geronimo's death, demanding the return of the head of their ancestor. Human remains are far from the only corporeal elements active in the world today. Think of the sale of organs and body parts, the international adoption market. Here, with this story, we're dealing with the politicized heads that have been taken, the realpolitik, if you will, of dead heads. To do it any justice, we have to consider the connections between such heads as material remains of the past that are being manipulated in some way. It's through their execution, excavation, decapitation, disinterment, disarticulation, reinterment, in other words, the wider national and international context of their manipulation as material objects that we can assess or reassess, narrate or re-narrate, write or rewrite for purposes of understanding the past. So what can the dead body politics, the taken head politics of a vanquished Native American military leader signify? One could easily dismiss this story. At least one Skull and Bones member and present-day secretary of the RTA Incorporated trust that runs the society has emphatically stressed that Geronimo's skull is not there, and it never has been there. It's just a story. It's not, and also adding that neither Prescott Bush nor any of the Bonesmen ever dug up the bones to begin with. It is just a story. Well, perhaps. Even if one isn't all that troubled by the theft of bones, certainly the idea that the story involves one of the country's powerful elite makes it more than a little troubling. This is all to say that while the head that is housed in Yale's Skull and Bones crypt may or may not belong to Geronimo, we do know that by the first quarter of the 19th century, and for a century thereafter, the US, from learned societies, museums, treasure hunters, grave robbers, archaeologists, antiquities enthusiasts, and apparently ancestors of US presidents, disinterred and collected hundreds of thousands of native remains. Given this larger context, it doesn't really matter whose head resides in the secret society's vault. Perhaps much more than Geronimo's head was unearthed and stored in Yale's tomb all those years ago. So what is it that we can ask ourselves? How do we make sense of any of this? And what can the taking of Geronimo's head tell us? In other words, what are the dead body politics of disarticulated heads in the North American context? When, why, and under what circumstances does the very materiality of the removed head, the taken head, enable the living to speak? Is there a larger, wider, historically significant pattern of toppling and taking heads to discern here? And I believe there is. There, I'm sticking my neck out. Take it away. In other words, this is an obvious way one can assert a claim to control, to power. And as it turns out, the very first instance in the English North American context of taking a native leader's head occurred in 1586, 1 year after England's first landfall in its New World, in its newfound land. The severed and displayed heads of 4 native leaders then, Winginas in the late 17th century, Medicom or King Philip in the 18th century, Osceola in the 19th century, and Geronimo's in the 20th century, enable us to discern an escalation of violence on the native body specifically, and native peoples more generally, both alive and dead. This escalation, symbolized by the taking of these 4 heads, marked critical changes in the processes of English, British, and eventually American colonization that span 4 centuries. And so what are these changes? So I'd like to argue that throughout the course of the 17th century, English colonizers increasingly refused to negotiate with native peoples as sovereign nations. And so with the consequential construction of native peoples as inhabitants, as subjects, rather than sovereign peoples, British colonials from the late 17th century onward determined that the rules of war governing conduct between sovereign nations no longer applied, and that native peoples were subject to English and later British civil law. The refusal of recalcitrant native leaders to comply was therefore seen as treasonous. And so to expose the deeply political nature of taking heads, we need to keep in mind history. Histories of taking heads in the North American colonial context is a transatlantic history. It involves the movement, interactions, and contestations of peoples across both time and space. In the present day, stories of taking heads are not seen as relevant to a larger narrative of American history. After all, how many of you have heard of any of these native leaders or the context of their deaths and consequential disarticulation? The first recorded instance of the English taking a native head, as I stated, was within a year of England's landfall. And it is with Wingina, otherwise known as Pemisipan, who hosted the newcomers on his island, Roanoke Island, which is off the coast of present-day North Carolina. Providing them his protection allowed Pemisipan to leverage his power against his own enemies, but when food became scarce and his people began to succumb to mysterious illnesses, his calculations backfired. Pemisipan began to warn other peoples about the English, pulled his people away from Roanoke Island, and plotted to bring together various neighboring coastal polities and attack the fledgling colony. The English discovered the plot against them through a hostage, and to sum it up very quickly, 26 English colonists stormed Desemunkepoch, a large settlement near Roanoke Island, and killed pretty much everyone in sight. As the chaos of battle raged around him, a wounded Pemisipan fled, but was felled by an Irishman, one Nugent, who returned out of the woods with Pemisipan's head in his hand. Returning to their seat at Roanoke, the English impaled Pemisipan's head on a pole assigned to any who might contemplate an assault on the newcomers. So this is the first sorry tale. Just a few decades before embarking on their first New World colonization project, the English attempted once more to complete their conquest of Ireland. And here I'm trying to ensure, at least in your minds, that for the English, this isn't a strange practice of, taking a head of someone that they wish to conquer and displaying it as a warning for others. Clearly, it's important in such a context to maintain material evidence of the deleterious effects of defying authority for public display, and as a form of political propaganda or intimidation. The public display of severed heads clearly served this purpose. Scholars generally agree that the primary function of the decapitated head was ceremonial, that it was part of a process of structuring, reinforcing, defending, and/or reordering hierarchical relationships between communities and individuals. And so in order to better contextualize the taking of heads in the North American context, we would do well to consider the fate of, some of you may know this gentleman, Oliver Cromwell, and his head, which he lost some 80 years after Pemisipan's execution and decapitation. If the taking of heads of those who once had power and their subsequent exhibition served as a warning to the living, as an assertion, as a sign of possession, spoken in the language of conquest, then a kind of tit-for-tat taking of heads played out spectacularly with the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. So here we have Cromwell. And again, just to root it in an ongoing practice, I'd like you to consider then, not too much time later, the decapitation and consequential disarticulation in a series of means of King Philip, or Medicom, as his name would be said in Wampanoag. He essentially attempted to oust colonists from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut colony. He lost, and thereby also lost his head. His head was on display in Plymouth colony for several decades. One of the Mathers is the primo intellectuals in New England at the time, talks about actually removing his jaw. And so, what I hope to do in the papers is to talk about the series of disarticulations of Native leaders that are enacted, as it were, performed in some sense. I wanted to situate the third removal of a head, as it were, with Osceola, who's a Seminole resistance leader. The context for the loss of his head, we can already see a change over from both Pemisipan and King Philip. Here we're situated in the 19th century. There's an intense interest by now the United States in acquiring an extensive history for itself, and that necessarily means trying to appropriate a past for itself that doesn't necessarily belong to it, but they need to make it their own. The other backdrop is the actual removal of Native peoples, at least across space. And so what you have with the image before and with this image here is, as I'd like to suggest, the removal of Native peoples was necessary both across time and space in order to articulate a kind of neo-indigeneity by so-called Americans. And which is why we need to consider Osceola. Here we have an acceleration of the violence that's performed on the Native body, whereas with Wingina, Pemisipan, and King Philip, they lose their heads as a consequence of battle. Here, Osceola, he's incarcerated. He dies of malaria, and it's within 24 hours of his death that he loses his head by his very own physician, who works at Fort Marion. And as I began with the story of Geronimo, he loses his head decades after his death. And so what I see here is an extended, evolving a level of violence that's perpetrated not only against living leaders in a contestation over power and sovereignty, if you will, but this level of violence pursues Native peoples beyond death. And with that, thank you very much for your indulgence. I welcome your suggestions.
A topic of human bodies within this larger theme of the symbolic is Henry Drewal. Henry is FU Bascom Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Henry.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're having a conversation. You have to reply. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. For a little change of pace, because my objective today is to bring you to your senses. Hit it. Can you bring it up a little bit higher? You're listening to Ricardo Limbo, a man from Angola who speaks in Lingala, speaks in Portuguese, speaks in Spanish, lives in Los Angeles. And he's performing for us a merengue. We've been hearing about taking heads. Our whole day today and tomorrow is about talking heads. Now I'm moving you to sensing bodies. Just listen to the music. Now close your eyes and listen to the music. Okay? Any differences that you perceived? Listening with your eyes open as opposed to listening with your eyes closed. I'm sure you've all been to concerts and listened in both ways, experienced in both ways. I think it's a simple but dramatic example of how we privilege certain senses and forget that all of the others are operating at the same time. We live in multisensorial worlds, and that's the way we experience them. So in bringing you to your senses, I want to introduce to you, you've had a chance to read my brief abstract, and I'll do my best to give you a few examples of my approach. I have developed well, first of all, I like to describe myself as an arts historian, because I'm interested in the performing arts as much as sculpture, architecture, painting, the visual arts. And I'm interested in that relationship between material culture and immaterial culture, which we have been playing with since this morning. I think they are inseparable, and I think a holistic approach to those multisensorial experiences of both material and immaterial. Transitory. Something happened to the mic. Maybe I should be on the panel in material culture and technology. Continue with this one. Okay. Good, thank you. That's good. Where was I?
Dancing.
Ah, dancing, yes. Oh, anybody could have gotten up to dance as well.
Now
But,
you say that?
huh?
Now you say that?
Yes. I'm sorry, Monica, I should have invited you in for earlier. So it is these multisensorial worlds that we live in. And I'm an arts historian who is interested in all of those things. I have developed an approach or a theory that I call sensiotics. And I'm organizing a symposium, which I'm going to change to a sensosium. All right, now this is playful, but it's serious at the same time, because I'm kind of playing with my semiotician friends and colleagues. Because semiotics is linguistically based, and I think we have to move away from that linguistic base to a multisensorial and a transdisciplinary approach. I have read in some of the chapters and some of the abstracts a reference to reading objects. I have to tell you, it makes me shiver when I hear that word, because we don't read paintings, we don't read buildings, we experience them. And when we come back to our senses and understand that these are multisensorial experiences, then we have to also recognize that each of the senses has its own way of impacting us, of shaping us, of giving us what we call art or material culture, those things that might be termed auras or enchantment, our relationship to those objects that makes us think and feel in different ways. The Yoruba, who I have worked with in West Africa, have a word for art, onna, which they would describe or analyze or say define as evocative form. These are the kinds of experiences that move audiences, that change the way we feel about the world, introducing us to something new, making us think differently. So my point about sensiotics is that the senses and understanding the role of the senses in the process of understanding, of experiencing and coming to understand our world is a multisensorial experience. And that the senses and understanding the role of those senses in those experiences, those evocative experiences, is crucial to any kind of deeper analysis and comprehension of them. I would maintain that sensing is constitutive of cognition. Sensing is thinking. Sensing is theorizing. And when we understand that those sensory experiences come from the very moment of our lives, and in fact, even before we come into the world, we are having sensory experiences that are starting to shape us. Those sensory worlds are then shaped from our biology or our nature and brought into the social world of culture and are shaped again. I think we can think of culture as an aesthetic system writ large. That is, a system of preferences, of patterns, of preferred ways of doing things. And I would say that those patterns are being ingrained and culturated in us from the moment we first reach this world. And those are multisensorial shapings that are happening. In the beginning, there was no word, only sensations. I'm up on my soapbox right now. And I think neuroscience is telling us that the senses are a very important part of cognition and of experience. I think about recent work on the plasticity of the brain, the continual production of neurons, that allow us to experience the world and learn from it continually. I think about the research on mirror neurons, that when we see something, our bodies do what we see being done. We feel it viscerally. And maybe mirror neurons is a term that privileges sight, but maybe those neurons are really empathy neurons that are translated into different sensory experiences, like having the hair stand up on our skin when we are frightened. And I think sensory analysis of sensory experience and the senses is also crucial, because those kinds of experiences are the things that are often beyond words, beyond expression. The sense of terror, a sense of fear. I mean, we have this, Yoruba have this expression saying, oya milenu. When there's something that you can't express in a word, they say, oya milenu, which means literally, my jaw drops open. We have similar expressions in other languages. So I think, and very often we use linguistically metaphors to talk about those expressive moments, those sensory moments. So I think this is a very important thing that we need to look at and analyze and consider in our analyses and our studies. Now, cultures shape sensoria. And various cultures understand and classify the senses in very, very different ways. And I think that needs our very detailed and specific research and study. My work among the Yoruba suggests to me that there are at least 7 that are important for the Yoruba, the typical 5 that we associate with sensing organs on our body, but 2 others as well that I think that need to be talked about individually and specifically. So how am I doing? I've got about 50 seconds. Oh, not even that. Okay, this is going to be quick. All right? I came to this approach to sensiotics because I apprenticed myself to a Yoruba sculptor when I was teaching there, because I decided that in order to understand the aesthetics and the preferences of those artists, I had to embody it myself as best I could. That apprenticeship led me to do sculpture as well as that mask. That red face mask that you see there is mine. I've been checking Sotheby's and Christie's to see when it's going to turn up at auction at high price. Let me raise a point. You know, I don't think we talk about insiders and outsiders. So while I apprenticed myself to this Yoruba sculptor, I couldn't become a Yoruba. But I think most of us in our lives are neither insiders or outsiders, but in-betweeners. And as people between cultures and experiencing multiple cultures, I think we can approach and understand multisensorial experiences in different cultural worlds. And this is part of the Gelede tradition of masquerading that you're seeing here, that combines both dance and song at night and drum rhythms and choreography, combining multisensorial events that are these ona, or evocative experiences. Art historians love to talk about body arts, and this Yoruba woman has these wonderful kolo tattooed designs on her upper chest. But for a Yoruba man and for Yorubas themselves, this is more a haptic experience, not a visual experience. As one Yoruba man told me, when we see a beautiful Yoruba woman with kolo on her body and we imagine touching her, oh, the weather turns to another thing. A masquerader in honor of warrior ancestors. He comes, creates chaos and warfare at the festival in honor of warrior ancestors. He has this blood-soaked tunic. While there is chaos and sound and movement and in the entire space, one of the things that is most powerful about this masquerader is his stench, because that tunic is coated with multiple years of blood sacrifice, of animal sacrifices, and that's what you smell before you actually see him come. And then for the Yoruba world, I think suprasensory perception, that is altered states of consciousness, is a crucial sense that needs to be considered. You're looking at 2 priestesses in trance, in altered states of consciousness. On the left, a woman who is in tune and embodies her water spirit, Mami Wata, and on the right, a Yoruba woman with her dance wand embodying Shango, god of thunder. That's it. Thank you.
And Henry thinking about human bodies and senses disarticulation of human bodies and the multiple aspects of the human sensorium. So I invite questions. Peter.
I had a question about the multiple meanings of severed heads as I was watching the screen. There seem to be trophy heads, there seem to be criminal heads because Cromwell's being assimilated to the traitors with their heads on pikes. And finally, I thought specimen head. This, in the age of phrenology, why would a head turn up in a druggist's window, except that he's got interesting bumps somewhere?
Yes, if I had 15 minutes. But yes, absolutely. And it's one of the means by which I'm able to track, right, this change in, I mean, there's a continuity in relation to these trophy heads, and the meanings, the narrations that come out of these heads will necessarily change over time, and so, you know, the traitor's head to the phrenologized head enables us to see that change over.
And Judy, you have a whole chapter eventually, so there will be time to elaborate on all these things. So, actually, John, and then Sarah.
I have a sort of general question for both of you, and I enjoyed your papers. I think that it seems to me there's a lot of convergence between body theory and material culture theory. And for example, they're both places where you bridge the divide between internal and external, or subjective and objective, or subjectivity. And on the other hand, we seem to have a strong taboo against equating people with things at a very fundamental level. And I guess what I'm wondering is, do you consider the body material culture? Or is the body something material culture goes on, or with, or around, or whatever?
I'm going to pick the coward's way out of this. It's not about my interpretation of it. Rather, what I wanted to focus on was the ways in which, at least, you know, when we get to the 19th and 20th century, and again, we can track, we can chart the ways in which the body, and specifically the head in this instance, or heads in this instance, become things, and they're made to operate as things, and not necessarily as people. So.
I guess just to respond quickly to that, maybe it's because historically we have a taboo against equating people with things, that the body can then act as a site of power in this sort of punitive way of dissecting criminals or putting heads on pikes that you mentioned. If we didn't have that taboo to start with, then you can imagine a lot of the operations being positive or different or having different flavor.
I mean, I can qualify that, you know, there's a necessary tension that exists, right? I'm looking at the ways in which these taken heads are interpreted by the takers of these heads, and trying to inject, if you will, a native sensibility, a response to that. This is what I'm seeing. What I have not interrogated, and I don't know, I'll ask you whether I should interrogate not so much the consequential response of Native peoples to these practices, because they're very much responding to the history of these practices, but depending on which Native group that you're talking to, their relationship to the body and their dead are going to be very different. So in the Geronimo case, for example, what I found very fascinating was that here are his descendants who are asking to reclaim the body, knowing full well that for Apache and Diné people at large, the relationship to the dead, it's extremely removed. You know, they inhabit a world that they need not have or should not have anything to do with. So, this demand for the remains of their ancestors is very controversial among the Apache.
Henry.
Yeah. I think very definitely bodies are objects. They are material culture. I think, seems to me, I mean, for me, the whole interest in material culture and visual culture and so on is the relationship between objects and people and objects. I have a PhD student who's working on a topic in Tanzania, working with diviners, women diviners who are in charge of initiations and also divination sessions. And essentially what she's finding is that the objects that they manipulate become persons, and those persons, those women, those diviners become objects. There's this very intimate back and forth and exchange that goes on. And it seems to me that that kind of interplay, that kind of intersection is what we're talking about when we talk about enchantment, when we talk about aura. It applies and is attained by human beings, but also objects because of our interrelationship and interactions.
Sarah and then Alaya.
Some of what I was going to ask has been answered, but I wanted to just ask Judy a related question about the with Medico. And you said his jaw was disarticulated by one of the Mathers. I'm curious which one, whether it was cotton or increase, depending on.
Cotton.
I would assume it's cotton, but so it's like 20 years after maybe he's done, but he was executed. But I also wanted to ask you to put you. I agree with these trophy heads, as displays of power, but I wondered if you could say a word or two about the context of dissection and disarticulation of executed criminals, which was legal in in the 17th century Massachusetts. That was the source, and it was expected that they were objects to be studied in that way, and.
Yeah, it's thank you. Very good question. The native body has become criminalized.
But in this case, he was the leader of a rebellion. He's an executed prisoner. But native or not, he was legitimate for dissection.
Not so much for dissection, but for so what happens to the traitor is hung, drawn, and quartered, and then his head is removed. And that is the way. When you read the descriptions from Benjamin Church to William Hubbard, they're very consistent in their description of King Philip as a traitor, which when I first began reading this so many years ago, I found puzzling, but then, with a very snappy education, I was able to pull together the pieces as to why he would be deemed not so much. He's not an enemy that's countering the sovereignty of the colony. Instead, he is a traitor of that colony. And so what has happened in Montana?
Right, there's that whole other level of meaning with him.
Exactly. So
I was just saying it was common for those who were executed for capital crimes, traitorous or not, to be dissected in colonial Massachusetts.
He is dissected.
Right.
And so yes, he's slain in battle, and beyond dissection. And beyond the removal of his head, what's sensational, and again, this accretion of violence,
Yes.
is that there's a requirement that his bones not be buried.
Right. They're clearly,
Yeah. Yeah, and so
want
that's
to show
beyond
disrespect to him.
Yeah,
I
but
agree.
beyond dealing with the criminal of the colony, there's something going on in relation to a contested, subjectivities and sovereignties.
alive.
Judy, in relation with this ideological decapitation, do you know the story of Inca Atahualpa's death? Because it has two versions. One is the Spanish version, and it was supposed to be killed in another way, but the other one is the Andean version. And in their cyclical notion of history, they decided to create the idea that Atahualpa was decapitated. And this is very important because it helps to maintain the idea that the head and the body will be together again, and the Tahuantinsuyo or the Andean Empire will be strong enough to enlighten the political campaign. So there is this controversy of the head of being the trophy of the two bands. What do you think about that?
Well, I was very, or I wanted to be very specific that this is a very Anglo-rooted phenomenon, although I'm not arguing for an American exceptionalism. But, and not being an expert by any means on the, what happens to Atahualpa. From what I understand, and this is from engaging with the Wampanoag people, and not just in the present day, but through studying the language, they didn't have a previous sense of kind of that there's something going on with the head. If anything, linguistically, the way Wampanoag articulate the body, and this is what I found entirely fascinating. Maybe one day I'll write on that. Someone needs to write on that. It's embedded within the knowledge that the body exists as a whole, and that it is animate because of the ways in which the parts of the body relate to one another. And at least linguistically, the way the body is articulated in Wampanoag is as a kind of, and this is what blew me away, a medicine wheel. And what animates it is the relationship of the parts to one another. Once you disarticulate something, and this is again how it operates linguistically, it cannot exist. And you find this in the language of deeds, and protests to the rupture of peoples from the land itself, because it's the land that animates the human being. And without the land, the human being falls, and they'll use that term. And so you need the head, at least the way I would understand it. So the Wampanoag did not construct what the Inca did.
This is what you find in the pleas to the General Court of Massachusetts from Wampanoag peoples. Yes. Thanks, Judy. And I have to leave the last question to Peter.
No, you don't have to. But I just for the group as a whole, we had a talk here about 4 years ago on the subject of the brain as material culture, pushing the neuroscience argument. It was an art historian, and the audience of art historians were up in arms at the idea and at the attempt to use the brain as a way of interpreting our reactions. So it's 4 years later, and it's an audience of historians. People don't seem troubled by this question of the body and brain as material culture, neuroscience, or is it a troubling subject? Question mark.
I think at that point we should discuss this over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. I'd like to thank the session speakers.